Normalizing morning brain fog is a catastrophic medical error. Millions of exhausted adults completely ignore the biological reality that their daily food is rotting their brain from the stomach up, trading elite cognitive function for a fatal, highly processed diet that guarantees permanent neurodegeneration. Society aggressively accepts chronic fatigue, memory loss, and a lack of motivation as standard conditions of aging or the unavoidable cost of a busy professional life. They are completely blind to the systemic cellular decay occurring within their own gastrointestinal tract. Modern industrial diet is not simply lacking in optimal nutrition. It is an engineered biological weapon meticulously designed to castrate baseline motivation and induce chronic lethargy. The mainstream narrative heavily promotes the consumption of synthetic seed oils, artificial sweeteners, heavy emulsifiers, and hyperprocessed carbohydrates, falsely labeling them as safe for human consumption. In the realm of clinical psychiatry and preventive medicine, this specific combination of ingredients is recognized as a slow-acting neurotoxin. The physical damage begins immediately upon ingestion in the stomach, rapidly initiating a massive cascade of systemic neuroinflammation that travels directly to the skull. Those who remain willfully blind to the clinical breakdown exposed in the next few minutes are actively choosing to accelerate their own cognitive decline. They will remain permanently locked in a state of sluggish, highly reactive mediocrity, biologically incapable of operating at a high status in any competitive environment. What is the biological truth of the gut-brain axis? Understanding this severe cognitive decay requires examining the human body's highly complex secondary neural network, known scientifically as the enteric nervous system. This massive biological superhighway consists of over 500 million neurons embedded directly into the lining of the intestinal walls. It operates entirely independently of the brain, yet it completely dictates the brain's operational capacity. This structure is intimately connected to the primary brain inside the skull through the vagus nerve, a massive biological cable that transmits millions of chemical and electrical signals every single second. When an individual consumes a highly processed, toxic diet filled with artificial preservatives, they are actively and severely damaging this critical communication pathway. Modern gastroenterology proves definitively that the stomach dictates the baseline performance of the prefrontal cortex. If the gut is filled with inflammatory, synthetic fuel, the enteric nervous system instantly detects a biological threat. The vagus nerve immediately transmits violent distress signals directly upward to the central nervous system. The brain responds to this gastrointestinal emergency by drastically slowing down executive function. It violently diverts finite metabolic energy away from high-level problem-solving, impulse control, and creative synthesis, forcing that energy downward into the digestive tract to manage the toxic biological disaster. This creates a severe evolutionary mismatch. The individual sits at a desk attempting to focus on complex, high-stakes professional tasks, but their biological hardware is entirely consumed by an internal inflammatory crisis. Elite cognitive performance requires a pristine, frictionless internal environment. When the gut is chronically inflamed, cardiovascular health plummets, and the brain is starved of clean, highly oxygenated blood. The exhausted individual falsely believes they lack psychological discipline or willpower. They blame their work ethic, completely unaware that their neurological hardware is physically suffocating due to the toxic fuel they blindly ingested just hours prior. The diet forces the nervous system into a perpetual state of biological panic, making deep work physiologically impossible. How does a fatal diet directly cause systemic neuroinflammation? Brain fog is heavily romanticized by modern hustle culture as a badge of honor, a supposed indicator of grinding hard. In strict clinical reality, brain fog is the undeniable physical manifestation of severe neuroinflammation. To understand this terrifying pathology, one must look directly at the structural integrity of the intestinal lining. A healthy, optimized gut lining is tightly sealed by complex proteins, acting as an elite security system that allows only fully broken down, beneficial micronutrients to enter the bloodstream. However, the continuous, daily consumption of modern, highly processed food physically destroys this vital barrier. Artificial emulsifiers and refined sugars actively burn through the protective mucosal layer. They create microscopic perforations in the intestinal wall, triggering a highly dangerous clinical condition known as intestinal permeability or leaky gut syndrome. When this delicate barrier shatters, a catastrophic biological event occurs. Toxic metabolic waste, undigested food particles, and harmful bacterial endotoxins, specifically lipopolysaccharides, leak directly out of the stomach and into the central bloodstream. The immune system instantly recognizes these floating particles as deadly foreign invaders and launches a massive, violent systemic inflammatory response to neutralize the threat. However, these neurotoxins do not remain safely quarantined in the lower body. They travel straight upward through the cardiovascular system, aggressively crossing the highly sensitive blood-brain barrier. Once inside the skull, these toxins trigger the brain's internal immune cells, known as microglia. The activated microglia rapidly release inflammatory cytokines, bathing the delicate neural networks of the prefrontal cortex in severe oxidative stress. Neurons literally lose their ability to fire quickly and accurately. This is the exact, undeniable biological mechanism of brain fog. The brain is physically swelling, suffocating under the heavy weight of toxic metabolic waste leaking from a rotting stomach. The individual loses the capacity to recall specific words, hold unbroken focus, or execute long-term strategic planning. Operating with chronic brain fog is actively allowing early-stage neurodegenerative disease to lay its foundation in real time. What are the clinical signs of a rotting gut microbiome? The physical symptoms of severe internal decay are constantly ignored by the average worker. The modern medical industry profits immensely from this widespread normalization, prescribing heavy synthetic medications to treat surface-level symptoms while entirely ignoring the biological root cause in the stomach. Rotting gut microbiome presents very specific, undeniable clinical warning signs that cannot be faked. The healthy human stomach contains trillions of beneficial bacterial colonies responsible for breaking down food and synthesizing vital neurochemicals. When the daily diet consists primarily of processed sugars, seed oils, and chemical preservatives, these beneficial bacterial colonies are rapidly massacred. They are aggressively replaced by highly pathogenic bacteria that thrive on systemic dysfunction and inflammation. The very first clinical sign of this massive microbiome collapse is the complete inability to sustain deep, restorative delta-wave sleep. Without a highly functioning gut flora, the human body cannot properly regulate core temperature during the night, nor can it synthesize the necessary precursors for melatonin production. The individual wakes up feeling entirely unrefreshed, dragging a heavy, sluggish physical vessel out of bed despite spending 8 hours horizontally. Second undeniable sign of a rotting gut is chronic, inexplicable lethargy immediately following a meal. In a biologically optimized human, food is swiftly converted into immediate, clean cellular energy. In a highly compromised individual, a processed meal triggers a massive, unnatural spike in blood glucose followed by a devastating chemical crash, leaving the central nervous system completely drained. This constant, violent fluctuation destroys insulin sensitivity and heavily accelerates cellular aging. The individual becomes highly dependent on synthetic external stimulants. They consume massive amounts of artificial caffeine and energy, drink simply to reach a pathetic baseline level of normal functioning. This dependency is not a quirky personality trait. It is a severe clinical symptom of a rotting biological engine that is actively failing to convert fuel into energy. How does toxic metabolic waste destroy the dopamine baseline? The field of psychopharmacology tightly guards the terrifying reality of how the gut directly controls human motivation. Dopamine is the universal neurochemical currency of ambition, aggressive drive, and high-status execution. The mainstream narrative constantly suggests that dopamine is solely produced and managed inside the brain. This is biologically false. The vast majority of the body's serotonin and a massive percentage of the critical precursor amino acids required to synthesize dopamine, such as tyrosine and tryptophan, are manufactured by the beneficial bacterial colonies living inside the gut microbiome. When an individual engages in a fatal diet, they are actively burning down the exact biological factory responsible for generating their own motivation. As toxic metabolic waste floods the system and eradicates these essential bacteria, the raw materials needed for neurochemical synthesis vanish. The brain simply cannot produce dopamine. Furthermore, the remaining dopamine receptors in the prefrontal cortex aggressively downregulate to protect themselves from the severe neuroinflammation caused by the leaky gut. They become completely blunted and insensitive. The individual loses their primal evolutionary drive to conquer, build, and dominate their environment. They wake up feeling entirely numb, devoid of the aggressive ambition required to succeed in a highly competitive hierarchy. This is the exact moment the engineered industrial food matrix claims total victory over the human mind. The individual is now biologically trapped in a cage of their own making. Because their internal endogenous dopamine production has completely collapsed, they desperately seek cheap, artificial spikes of external pleasure just to feel a fleeting sense of being alive. They consume more highly processed food, endlessly scroll digital dopamine feeds, and rely heavily on synthetic, pacifying entertainment. They become the perfect, docile, highly profitable consumer. Their biological baseline of motivation has rotted away entirely, replacing the high-tier drive of an apex predator with the weak, easily manipulated neurochemistry of a perpetual victim. The fatal diet has successfully chemically castrated their highest biological potential. How does the medical and food matrix profit from cognitive decay? The entire matrix of the modern digital and healthcare economy is heavily dependent on keeping the global population perpetually sick, tired, and biologically compromised. This is not a conspiracy. It is a meticulously engineered business model. Fully rested, biologically optimized human with a pristine gut microbiome is incredibly dangerous to the established status quo. They possess the vital physical energy to question authority. They have the deep, unfragmented focus required to build independent, generational wealth. They have the supreme cognitive clarity to instantly reject toxic environments, toxic products, and low-status narratives. Therefore, the industrial complex aggressively promotes the fatal diet. Food scientists are paid billions of dollars to engineer hyperpalatable processed foods that completely bypass the brain's natural satiety signals, forcing the individual to overconsume toxic fuel. Once the individual is biologically compromised by leaky gut and severe neuroinflammation, they become the ultimate compliant consumer, directly fueling the massive profits of the sick care industry. The medical establishment does not offer protocols to heal the intestinal lining. Instead, it offers highly lucrative lifelong prescriptions for synthetic antidepressants, sleep aids, and focus stimulants. These pharmaceuticals merely mask the neurochemical collapse while the underlying biological rot continues to spread. When the exhausted worker finally finishes their corporate grind, their cognitive defenses are completely shattered by the systemic inflammation. They do not have the residual metabolic energy to read, to engage in preventive medicine, or to train their physical body. They collapse onto a couch and hand their incredibly valuable attention directly over to advertisers. The attention economy seamlessly extracts billions of dollars from this state of chronic fatigue. Social platforms, meticulously designed by behavioral neuroscientists, mercilessly exploit the exhausted, brain-fogged mind. The individual falsely believes they are simply relaxing after a long day, but they are actually being actively harvested. The fatal diet ensures they never possess enough biological power to actually execute an escape plan. They wake up the next day, drink their synthetic stimulant, eat another processed meal, and step right back into the machine. What is the exact protocol to heal the gut-brain axis? The window of opportunity to escape this massive biological trap is actively closing right now. Every single meal consumed under the standard modern diet accelerates the permanent death of cognitive pathways. Ignoring the clinical reality of the gut-brain axis is a direct, conscious choice to accept irreversible cognitive decline, chronic fatigue syndrome, and a life of low-status mediocrity. Elite performers and top-tier biohackers are monopolizing the exact longevity protocols required to restore this neuroarchitecture today. Reclaiming absolute biological dominance requires the total, violent destruction of the fatal diet. The modern healthcare system is entirely reactive, designed to manage chronic disease rather than optimize elite human performance. Healing the gut-brain axis requires executing a strict, uncompromising clinical protocol before the neural damage becomes entirely permanent. This protocol begins with the aggressive, absolute elimination of all highly processed toxic fuel. Synthetic seed oils, refined industrial sugars, artificial emulsifiers, and chemical preservatives must be entirely eradicated from the daily environment. There is no moderation when dealing with neurotoxins. The biological machine must then be forced into a deep state of cellular autophagy through structured clinical fasting. Autophagy is the body's highly advanced internal macro-waste clearance mechanism. When the digestive system is finally given a prolonged period of absolute silence, the body actively hunts down and destroys the toxic metabolic waste floating in the bloodstream. This fasting window allows the intestinal lining the critical time required to physically heal and seal its microscopic perforations, permanently stopping the leakage of endotoxins into the brain. Furthermore, the decimated microbiome must be aggressively rebuilt. This requires the strategic, daily introduction of highly bioavailable prebiotics and clinical-grade, multi-strain probiotics to rapidly re-establish the beneficial bacterial colonies that synthesize dopamine and serotonin. The nervous system must be heavily supported with massive doses of high-quality, omega-3 fatty acids to immediately reduce the acute neuroinflammation suffocating the prefrontal cortex. Output must be strictly monitored, prioritizing deep, unfragmented delta-wave sleep in a pitch-black, cold environment to allow the lymphatic system to flush the accumulated beta-amyloid proteins entirely out of the skull. Healing the gut is not a casual lifestyle choice or a temporary trend. It is a mandatory, non-negotiable biological recalibration for anyone serious about unlocking elite cognitive performance. Understanding this classified clinical reality provides a massive advantage, but simply knowing is entirely useless without aggressive, uncompromising daily execution. The mainstream food and medical industries rely entirely on keeping the public biologically weak, perpetually exhausted, and highly profitable. The specific microprotocols required to cleanse the microbiome, rebuild the intestinal wall, and restore dopamine synthesis are actively suppressed by the algorithm because an optimized human deeply threatens the attention economy. The window to access these daily tactical commands and reverse the structural brain damage is shrinking fast. Cost of inaction is permanent neurodegeneration and a total collapse of ambition. Subscribe to this channel right now to secure your biological baseline and permanently reject this engineered cellular decay. Then go directly to the links in the description to access the exact step-by-step clinical protocols required to heal the gut today. Do not wait for the fatal diet to completely rot your nervous system. Take absolute control.